Good morning. Nearby, fewer than 10 miles from here actually, is a neighborhood called Washington Township. Growing up, I spent many hot summer Sundays there, splashing around an above-ground swimming pool in my grandparents' backyard. My brother and cousins and I would race and swim and Marco Polo until exhausted we'd flop onto the deck, soggy and stinking of chlorine to dry off. And we'd play this game. Maybe you've played this game. We'd close our eyes, tilt our faces up toward the sun, and watch the shapes that passed beneath our eyelids, calling them out to one another. I see a red triangle, or maybe it's blue. No, I see a squiggle. Mine's a red squiggle. Do you see it? And while we played this game, I often found myself wondering, were we seeing the exact same things and just describing them differently? Or were we seeing entirely different things? But of course, there was no way to know, right? Our eyes were closed. Well, years later, I was an undergraduate in the 90s. So picture oversized flannel shirts and ripped jeans, but the homemade kind, shorn by hand and shredded in the dryer. Oh, and black steel-toe boots to get me safely through anything a liberal arts college education might throw my way. I studied history and film and creative writing. And for my senior thesis, I chose a topic that allowed me to further explore those interests. I decided to write about the daily life and cultural influences of the 1930s. As you may know, those were very difficult times. Studied a lot of the history. I read endless books, which involved battling the Dewey Decimal System bravely, not always successfully. And I watched the films, which were just brilliant. But I also wanted some first-person narrative. So I reached out and I met with men and women who had grown up during that time period. I wanted to hear from them what life was like. And I thought I had a pretty good idea of what we would discuss. Uta, Margaret, Edward, Henry. These men and women welcomed me into their homes and their businesses and their memories. They talked about the day-to-day challenges of not having enough food to eat, not having medication when ill. Margaret told me about watching her mother unravel old sweaters to reuse the yarn because they didn't have enough money for new clothing to stay warm. And Uta, who lived in a rural area, she told me about a doll and what her mother had to trade for that single but cherished treasure. And she told me about a neighbor and good friend of hers whose father had lost his job and how one day she woke up and they were gone. And nobody could tell her where they went. There were secrets. There were words unspoken. And many of them talked about a deep, dark fear on the faces of their parents. But there was also hope. One man in particular, Henry, he was a good-looking man. Even in his older years, he was tall and strong. I met him in a nursing home. It was a nursing home that defied nursing home stereotypes. It was brightly lit, well-appointed, decorated in red and green. Nothing hung in the air, no scent, no heaviness of history and years gone by. I remember thinking, this is the way to do old. He greeted me gallantly, and we sat near tall windows with a table between us. I had a tape recorder, and jazz music from the late 20s and early 30s actually piped through the background. I remember the way his eyes lit up when he talked to me about the hope that got him through the difficult days. He talked about his love of film and comedy and romance. It's basically the same in every generation, he said. And he talked to me about a youth group that captured his imagination. In this youth group, everyone had uniforms, so no one had more or less visibly. And there was sports, and there was friendship, and there was something to believe in. Something to aspire to. See, these boys were told that they already had within them everything they needed to be great. The best of the best. They were the elite, leaders. Sure, Henry said. He knew he was being told a bit of a story, but it was a story he wanted to hear. When he spoke, I could almost forget that the backdrop was Germany in 1938, and that his youth group was called the Hitlerjugend. And he could almost forget that I was the young Jewish college student he'd agreed to speak with. Almost, but not quite. Any regrets? I said to him before leaving. You seem like a very nice young lady, he said to me. But I tell you, had the war gone the other way, I would have been one of the worst ones. See, my thesis was about German daily life and cultural influences before and during World War II. The German-American consulate had been kind enough to help me meet with German-American immigrants who welcomed the opportunity to be heard. These conversations, they didn't make me an activist, nor an atheist, maybe an empathist, though that's not a word. I learned a tremendous amount about the human experience and human nature that year, as well as something fundamental, yet jarring, that has changed the way that I try to communicate and help others communicate ever since. We do not always see the same thing. What I see with my eyes closed may not be what you see. In fact, I'm quite convinced that what I see with my eyes open is not what you see either. Whether red squiggle, or a contentious board, or a difficult teacher, or global unrest, or the earliest bedtime of all my friends' mom. And until you can see what your opponent in conversation sees, you cannot really be heard. Now, to be clear, there's no excusing evil. You don't need to agree with your opponent in conversation. I hope that none of you ever sits before someone who isn't sure you should have been born, but what I do hope for you is the ability to better communicate through conflict by mastering 4 practices in communications. Listen, learn, reflect, connect. Listening, that sounds obvious, right? But for communicators, that's tough. But also, if you've got something to say, listening can be hard, but you've got to listen. And then learn. Can you see what they see? Can you feel it? Reflect. Check in with them. Did you get that right? And then connect. Now share what it is that you see, what it is that you want to say. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by how willing another human being is to walk with you down that now converging path. Let's talk through 3 quick, relatable examples. Say you're on the phone with Verizon. You're on hold. Again, relatable? Okay. When eventually you hear, "Hello, Mrs. Wellfeld, how are you today?" "Well," I say, I'm actually a little bit frustrated. This is my 3rd time calling about the same issue." Okay, now this could go 2 ways. The customer service rep could say, "Okay, ma'am, what's your order number?" Now, first of all, she called me ma'am. But second, it's Groundhog Day, right? Or she could say, "I am so sorry to hear that you're having a frustrating experience and that this isn't the first time you've tried to resolve it. Can I have your order number so that we can get this figured out for you?" She hears me. She feels me. And not only that, she goes on to rather quickly resolve the issue, I believe, largely because she set the stage and we're able to now communicate calmly together. She does so well that I asked to speak with her supervisor after because I believe she should be recognized. Frontline customer service is frontline corporate reputation, after all. But she listened, she learned, she reflected so that we could connect. Let's do another example. We'll bring this one home. Say you and your significant other, you share a bedroom, and your partner wants a very expensive bedspread, comforter. But you manage the household budget and you are sure this one is out of reach financially. This could go 2 ways. You could argue over how expensive the bedspread is, why one of you needs to earn more money, who's not earning enough. What's wrong with your white down comforter? These are first world problems, if you haven't noticed. Or you could stop and listen and try to learn what's behind this interest. Let's say in this example, you discover that your partner, who's very stressed, and so are you, by the way, because life is stressful, is looking to create a spa-like decor in the bedroom to instill a sense of zen, a stress-free zone. Well, that you can kind of understand. So maybe instead you say, okay, you want our bedroom to be a refuge, a respite from the day-to-day stress. I get that. That actually sounds great. But for me, sleeping under a comforter that I think is out of reach for us financially, that brings stress into that bedroom, into that bed that we share. Can we figure this out together? So remember, this process, it doesn't eliminate the conflict. It just allows you to better communicate together through it. One more example. Your teenage son, again, he's convinced that all of his friends have a bedtime 2 hours later than he does. This conversation can go only one way. Too bad, I'm your mother. See, not every conversation requires mutual understanding. Which brings me back to Henry. Ours was not one of those conversations that requires mutual understanding. I was there to listen and to learn and to reflect. But I don't want you to think I didn't respond to Henry. And to those who told him a story that wiped nearly an entire side of my family off the face of the earth. I responded to Henry, and I try to respond to him every day, in every way that I live and love and learn and listen. Thank you.